While a Jewish state, as a nation state, can in fact be democratic, the question that both Jews in Israel and Jews around the world are struggling with is, why isn't it living up to these principles? On issues of religious pluralism and the attitude of Israel to Jews of different opinions, and on the issue of the rights of minorities within the state of Israel, numerous Jews are finding Israel lacking. They're being placed in a position where they're being forced to ask whether they have to sacrifice their Jewish principles and their democratic loyalties and their loyalty and commitment to their own Judaism on the altar of a loyalty to the state of Israel. If state of Israel requires that, then the future between Israel and world Jewry is not strong. We need to create a new foundation and a new way of thinking about issues of both religious pluralism and about issues of minorities if Israel is going to live up to its goal to be both Jewish and democratic. On the issue of religious pluralism, the record of the state of Israel is deeply flawed. In the new narrative between Israel and world Jewry, we stated at the outset that love of Israel is not going to be determined by accepting what Israel is, but by creating a language which defines where Israel ought to go, what Israel ought to be. And that one's commitment to Israel is not determined by the declaring of Amen with regard to what Israel does, but a willingness to be involved and invested in changing and rebuilding the Israel that we believe we deserve. Nowhere is this issue more central and more profound than when it comes to the issue of religious pluralism. Now, for many people, the argument is that the story's over. Israel's lost the battle of religious pluralism. People look at the ultra-Orthodox population and say they're growing, and since they're not committed to religious pluralism, basically the state of Israel will never be a religious pluralistic country, and as a result cannot claim my loyalty, and it's a place that I can't be connected to. I, as a conservative Reform Jew, will have no place here. I, as a liberal Jew, by definition, am going to be an outsider. The more one focuses on the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, the more one lays a foundation for the perpetual alienation of world Jewry from the state of Israel. Now, they're correct. On the one hand, the ultra-Orthodox are not committed to religious pluralism. And the ultra-Orthodox have significant power in the governing of the state of Israel. They have a party which sits in the government. Liberal Jews do not. They're growing in number. There is, however, a fatalistic perspective and way of thinking with regard to the Haredim, which I think it's very important that we dispel from the outset. Today, the ultra-Orthodox population of the state of Israel accounts for only 10% of the population. While they're growing, for the foreseeable future, we are not confronting a majority of Israelis who are ultra-Orthodox. And it's important to remember that the ultra-Orthodox community is going to be profoundly challenged when their numbers grow. They're able to maintain their loyalty of their constituents when they're a minority and where there's clear walls and where everybody could stay in the ghetto. But as they expand, they're going to be forced to integrate into the modern world, and how that's going to impact on the Haredi world, nobody knows. But regardless of how we predict the outcome of Haredi growth on the future of the state of Israel, that's not our problem today. 90% of Israelis are allowing 10% to determine the issue of religious freedom and religious pluralism and religious legislation in the state of Israel. Our problem when it comes to religious pluralism is not the ultra-Orthodox. And when we focus on them, we are diverting our energy in not only in a non-constructive, but I believe in a mistaken direction. The fundamental problem with religious pluralism in Israel is that the non-ultra-Orthodox of Israelis aren't committed to religious pluralism, when they should be. Too many of them see themselves as outside of the discussion, as outside of those who get to determine what does it mean to be Jewish, and as a result they abrogate their vote to the ultra-Orthodox. Or often what they do is they're willing to sacrifice issues of religious pluralism on the altar of foreign policy. If an ultra-Orthodox party will vote for my foreign policy platform, I'll give them who is a Jew, I'll give them Pesach laws, I'll give them control over the rabbinate. But Israelis are willing to do that because they don't recognize the price that they pay. Israelis don't see themselves primarily as significant players in this story called Judaism. Religious pluralism is only possible when you see yourself as involved and invested, and therefore you fight for religious diversity because you're fighting for place for yourself and for others around the table. But if you don't even want to be a part of the table, if you have no desire to go to the Kotel in the first place, why should you fight for the rights of women of the wall? You don't even understand. Forget it, leave the Kotel. You bequeath the Kotel to the ultra-Orthodox because you yourself don't see yourself as invested and belonging there. If we want to change the issue of religious pluralism in Israel, the first thing we need to do is not worry about the ultra-Orthodox, but create a Jewishly invested, secular and traditional Israeli. As long as secular and traditional Israelis see authentic Judaism as orthodox, see themselves as outside of the conversation, there's not going to be any religious pluralism in Israel. That is stage one. And therefore, the first foundation of building religious pluralism is creating within Israel a platform for a profound Jewish education around all over the country. When secular and traditional Jews will have a stronger Judaism, then they're going to have to stand up and say, excuse me, what about my place? When they feel that they have something at stake, then religious pluralism is not going to be an issue for the liberal Jew who doesn't live here, but it will be an issue for the Jew who lives here who says, I can't breathe in this environment. I don't want to be ultra-Orthodox. I want a Judaism that I could call my own. When that happens, then the Jews of the world will have a partner and a foundation to build religious pluralism within the state of Israel. But there's something even deeper. Our problem is not simply the ultra-Orthodox sitting in the government. And our problem is not simply the passivity of the vast majority of Israelis who are willing to relinquish religious diversity and religious rights for themselves, for other agendas. There is something deeply flawed in the thought process which has accompanied us as we've returned to sovereignty and rebuilt the state of Israel. What has happened is that we haven't fully integrated and assimilated what we're doing here. I would say Israel is a country which is being run as if it was a shul, as if it was a synagogue. What do I mean by that? In the diaspora, in the decades and centuries of diasporic life, there were nuclear Jewish communities, and those communities were built around particular synagogues. Everybody went to the synagogue that followed their ideology. And as the jokes go, and as we know very well, synagogues are very, very particular. And they're places where individuals with a high level of agreement come to worship. And if you don't agree with me, go build your shul. I don't even want you in my shul. I actually get great joy when you're not in my shul. Sometimes the joke goes, I need two shuls, both the shul that I go to and the shul that I don't go to. Synagogue life allows for very, very strongly and carefully defined communities around systems of belief and practice, because no synagogue exhausts Jewish collective life. Synagogues live, by definition, alongside other synagogues. They flourish. My identity in my synagogue is stronger to the extent that you don't come, and that there's another synagogue. Now, we dreamed for 2,000 years to come back to Jerusalem to build a state, but I would argue we are still in the diaspora in our thought process. We haven't fully integrated what is the Zionist dream. What does it mean to build a homeland for the Jewish people? This homeland is not a synagogue. I can't tell to someone, excuse me, if you don't agree with me, leave. We are used to doing religion in the context of a synagogue. And we haven't yet developed sufficiently a Torah of how we do Judaism in the context of a public sphere. Oh, we know how to make Shabbos the national, day of rest. And we know how to talk about Yom Kippur and Pesach, and those issues we know how to deal with. But we haven't fully understood the collective Jewish identity of the State of Israel. Not in its expression in the public sphere, but in its expression in the realm of religious pluralism. When you're creating one state for all Jews, and you want Israel to be the homeland of all Jews, what makes this a Jewish state is not that all Jews could move here and then get ignored. It's not that all Jews could come here and serve in the army, but that all Jews have to be able to come here and feel that they come not just as potential soldiers and wage earners, but they come with their beliefs and ideologies and principles, and those beliefs and ideologies are respected. That it's a Jewish state in the sense that the diverse Judaisms of the Jews of Israel are flourished, are nurtured, are made possible. Now, in the past, when we wanted that to happen, we went to a synagogue, and it was mine. Now we have to learn how to do that together, within one shared space. Now, we haven't had to think that way and do that for close to 2,000 years. Diasporic Jewish life didn't prepare us for that. In many ways, I would say we need Israelis to make aliyah, in the deepest sense. They have to assimilate what it is that they're doing here. What is a homeland for the Jewish people? And how does that obligate them? To do so, we have to go back, in many ways, to the Talmud. We have to go back to that period where the rabbis began to ask, so how do we build a public sphere? How do we share our public life? What place does ideology and religious belief have in a community which disagrees with each other? Here, one of the fundamental texts and sources that we have is the whole way that the rabbis unfold the relationship between Hillel and Shammai. Not only do they declare that Hillel and Shammai, as they declare in Tractate Eruvin, that both are the words of the living God. Not only do they teach us that no single ideology can exhaust authenticity, and therefore when you build a synagogue, you have to allow another synagogue to exist, and to know that God prays there. And that when you bring Judaism to the State of Israel, you have to recognize that by definition there has to be multiple legitimate Judaisms. That's the essence of what our religious tradition believes. No single idea could ever exhaust what it means to be a Jew and what God wants. But our tradition goes even further than that. And in the relationship between Hillel and Shammai, as outlined in Tractate Yevamot and in the Tosefta, asks, how do we build a community together? How do we make sure that our religion doesn't divide us but unites us? You see, in the diaspora, in the past, even though Judaism divided us, since each had their own sphere, their own synagogue, their own source of authority, difference did not pull us apart. But how do we build a public sphere, one sphere, in which we learn how to share that public sphere? Our rabbis teach us that we must become people who love not only truth, not only our religious truths, but we must become a people who also love peace and coexistence within our community. And that our commitment to truth cannot override or take precedence over our responsibility to build one community. And as a result, Hillel and Shammai, even though they disagreed on so many issues, never stopped eating in each other's home and never stopped marrying each other. They learned how to take a step back and make sure that their particular religious beliefs allowed space for the other. Not just within the public domain, but also allowed interaction between us. We created the principle that even though the law follows Hillel, if you want to follow the laws of Shammai, you're allowed to follow them. A Jewish community never was religiously monolithic, never was legally monolithic. Maybe one small period of time during the Sanhedrin, and then probably not. Because Jews disagree. And we have to ask ourselves whether we're going to allow our disagreements to also destroy the Jewish people. Our tradition says you can't. Going back to the source that we learned beforehand, you have to sometimes break Torah for the sake of the Jewish people. Where is it that each one of us within the context of the state of Israel is willing to put our Torah aside and to say that since Israel belongs to all of us, it's not just about me? I have to live my own life, but I don't get to govern the public domain solely on the basis of my ideology. If in the prior lecture we spoke about the notion that Judaism must be the religion of the public sphere, and that the state of Israel must worry about the preservation of Jewish culture, no single ideology can exhaust that public sphere. And the state of Israel, while being an advocate of Judaism, cannot be the advocate of one particular type of Judaism. When it does that, it's bringing the diaspora to Israel. It's making Israel a synagogue, and in so doing, destroying the Zionist ethos and the Zionist aspiration of the state of Israel. But there is yet a second challenge, as I stated beforehand. Not only are we challenged on the issue of religious pluralism, on the place of Jews who disagree with each other within the public domain and political life of Israel. The second challenge of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is, how do we deal with the minority? How do we deal with the Arabs, who are approximately 25% of Israeli society, primarily Muslims and Christians and some Druze? What do we do? Here too, our record is not what it should be. Here too, we are not fulfilling the more noble of our religious aspirations and moral expectations. The state of Israel, on this issue, I believe, also hasn't yet made aliyah. We are so used to being a minority. We were so used to being in the diaspora as a minority, in which our philosophy and approach to the non-Jews was, I hope they leave me alone. The notion that we were responsible, the notion that we have power, and that we have to take responsibility for that power, that we have to take ownership over a public domain, and that yes, we are now living in a public domain in which there are non-Jews who are looking to us and are coming as a minority and saying, how, as you a majority, are you looking out for my rights? That's something that Jews, we haven't made that switch. But if we're still in the diaspora in that sense, then let's learn from the diaspora. What our tradition teaches us in Leviticus 19 is that you have to learn from your suffering on how you treat others. A Jewish state which is not an exemplar on the issue of the rights of a minority is not a Jewish state. A Jewish state which does not remember our experience as a minority and use it as the defining principle for how they are going to treat others has forgotten its past. We are a collective, and one of the takeaways of being a collective is that it gives us a sense of a connection to a past and a sense of a connection to our rootedness. But that's not in order to create some form of national identity alone. It's supposed to teach us. We're obligated to remember. And we're obligated to remember not to become chauvinists, but we're obligated to remember in order to learn what type of moral principles we want to use when we now govern. Now, on this issue, we're also deeply challenged. The fact that the state of Israel is still at war, and the fact that many members of the Arab minority of the state of Israel are nationally affiliated with communities with whom we are not yet at peace, creates a boundary right down the state of Israel. There's an enemy outside, but very often that language is also applied to those who are inside. And then it is very difficult to find the impetus, the desire within the majority of the state of Israel to say, yes, this is a minority, I am responsible for you. That's what democracy means. That's what being a Jew means. How could I forget? I was there. But when you're at war, very often you forget. And you allow yourself things. And it's difficult to generate the political will to overcome that inherent bias that you have. But here too, we have to turn back to our tradition. I understand and recognize the challenge we face. But between understanding and recognizing and justifying is very, very different. We can't justify that. We can't allow Israelis to close their eyes and to dream, I hope one day they'll disappear. If someone is a citizen of your country, you also have loyalty to him and her. That same bond of loyalty that we have to Jews, there is not only a Jewish nation, there's also an Israeli nation, and we have to come to terms with the fact that we have these dual national loyalties even within the state of Israel. We as Jews have to recognize that we are responsible and must express that responsibility with loyalty, with the allocation of resources, with the ensuring of the full rights of all those who are part of the Israeli nation, because we also have an Israeli nation. And we have to recognize that we are obligated to be loyal to them precisely because we are a Jewish nation. Now here, there's been a debate in our tradition. And very often, because we were in the diaspora for so long, we allowed this debate to continue much too long. Within our tradition, there is an ambivalent attitude towards non-Jews. And there's a line here too. Which path are we going to go? There is one path in our tradition which speaks about chosenness, which sees the Jewish people as having a unique relationship with God, which sees the Jewish people alone as being significant in the eyes of God, which thinks that the Jewish story begins only in the Exodus, and that we are God's loved ones, and that because of Exodus, God doesn't care about anybody else. We've heard that story. And while we're in the diaspora, that story didn't impact on our behavior, because a powerless people is always a moral people. But there is another voice. And that voice speaks about chosenness not as something that Jews inherit, but as something that we have to earn. And doesn't describe any unique value to Jews, and recognizes that God has a relationship with all human beings. Recognizes that the Bible doesn't begin in Exodus. It begins in Genesis, with all people being created in the image of God. That same principle which allows for our own self-defense and gives value to the Jew also gives value to all human beings. A Jewish tradition which doesn't begin its narrative with Jews and recognizes that God has a relationship with the whole world, and that chosenness is but one aspect of God's relationship to Israel, and as Amos says, that in fact God chooses other people as well. We don't exhaust God. We have to understand that if we are going to build the state that we deserve, if we're going to build the state that is worthy of the Jewish people, we're going to have to recognize the responsibility of power and to go back to our tradition and engage in a profound cultural war over which narrative we are going to allow to dominate our consciousness. The reality of war has given credence and support to notions of superiority, which allow us to ignore those who are not part of our smaller nuclear community. If Israel is going to be a Jewish democratic state, it's going to require of us to overturn that ideology. For us to go back to the books and ask, which ideologies did we allow to grow and to fester in a diaspora, which we can't allow anymore within the context of the state of Israel? Israel can be a Jewish and democratic state, but it's not something that we're going to inherit. It has to be something that we earn. We're going to need a completely different vision of what a homeland of the Jewish people means. Both what it means towards Jews and other people who disagree religiously, and what it means to a minority which lives here. When we recognize that, then we can move in the direction of building the Jewish democratic state that is the only type of state that could claim any loyalty and any love and commitment, both from Israelis, I believe, and from Jews around the world. We have a battle as to what type of Israel we're going to have. And the future of the state of Israel, not simply the future of the relationship of world Jewry to Israel, but the future of whether this is in fact Israel, is at stake. Jewish democratic is not a luxury. Jewish democratic is not something that we could simply yearn for. Jewish democratic is at the DNA and at the core of what Israel must be. And we must come closer and closer to overcoming the gap between what Israel is and what Israel must be, and in so doing fulfilling our Zionist aspiration and our Zionist responsibility. The new covenant which we're calling for requires that world Jewry be able to see Israel as a place where their Judaism also belongs. Not just a place where our money is welcomed, not just a place where our political advocacy is welcomed, but where the whole spectrum of my beliefs and my ideals and my values also have a home. What are the key features? If you had to pick, what does Israel have to change in order for us to create here that type of environment?
What Israel would have to do is, first of all, recognize that we need multiple rabbinates. We need to have recognition of different rabbinic courts that will administer marriages, divorces, and the like for a variety of different kinds of religious understandings. That's one. Two, Israel would have to give equal funding to all of the education and all of the synagogue activities of all of the recognized denominations. Only in that way could you have a full living of Judaism in Israel the way we enjoy it in North America and the way it has caused Judaism to flourish and evolve.
If I understand you correctly, what you're saying then, it's very interesting, is you're not saying that Israel has to separate state and religion in order to allow liberal Judaism. You're not saying let's create in Israel a North American public sphere. You're saying something different.
No, I'm saying something very different. In fact, I personally do not believe that it would be good for Israel or good for the Jewish people to have a separation of religion and state. I very much want Jewish values in the public square. I want Jewish education in the public schools, but I want there to be multiple possibilities and multiple interpretations of everything Jewish in those contexts. That would be the most healthy way to live out Judaism in the Jewish state.
Now, how would multiple rabbinates look? How would it work? Because many people they throw out this boogeyman that if we have multiple rabbinates in Israel, Jews won't be able to marry Jews. We're going to have to keep books. Every Jewish community is going to fall apart. And if Israel is the place which is supposed to be the homeland of the Jewish people, then by creating multiple rabbinates, you're destroying the home because we can't function with each other.
Right. That fear, first of all, is the success of the terrorizing of the Israeli population by the Orthodox rabbinate. It's false. We know that Judaism, certainly in the modern era, can live with multiple rabbinic courts. We know that, first of all, most of these courts, most of me and my colleagues, including modern Orthodox colleagues, we will find a way to respect and accept each other's ritual ceremonies and halachic decisions. There may be situations where if somebody wants to live according to an ultra-Orthodox definition, or marry or divorce, they may have to convert or reconvert or get divorced according to that court.
Let's be concrete. How would it work? there are multiple rabbinates converting Jews in different ways. I want to marry someone who is converted. I don't accept their conversion. What do I do?
So there are a couple of possibilities. First of all, I'm convinced that amongst the non-Orthodox rabbinates, first of all, we would have agreement that we would accept each other's conversion. So that wouldn't be a problem. The question would be if your daughter would want to marry somebody who had a conversion that would be non-Orthodox, and let's say you're an Orthodox person, perhaps she would need to reconvert. It would be very simple. She would go through what I might call a reaffirmation. They would call it a conversion. And if she wants to live that way, they could happily live that way simply by reconverting.
So the marriage ceremonies would then very often be connected to some new conversion or reaffirmation ceremonies.
That's right, if necessary, and that does happen today. We know from the citizens of the former Soviet Union, many of them who clearly have grown up Jewish, have been even beaten up for it. They come to Israel, they can't prove it. They're serving in the army. We have no question, our liberal rabbinic courts, about their Jewish status, but they need a reaffirmation, a reconfirmation. We don't call it a conversion, but we reaffirm their Jewish status so that they have the right paperwork, so that, God forbid, should they die because they were a Jew serving the Jewish state, they can be buried in a Jewish cemetery.
So we could have multiple rabbinates. Multiple rabbinates will work.
That would be a big difference.
Let's take another place, or another case which is extremely problematic for many Jews. When you want to separate the public and the private, when you want to keep religion in the private domain, everybody has their own private domain. But as you yourself said, that you don't want separation of religion from state. That means you want the public sphere to be imbued with religious sensibilities. But in Israel, not every public sphere is dividable. There is, for example, there is only one kotel. How would we solve the kotel problem? Could we solve the kotel problem?
Currently, we're in a situation of an uneasy, I would say, temporary compromise. The compromise situation is that if you and I want to have an egalitarian ceremony, we simply move our ceremony from the Kotel, that plaza place that we all know and have seen pictures of for generations. We simply move down the wall and do it at Robinson's Arch, where we have fought a very, very complicated battle over many years to have the right to do that, and you and I can do that there. What's the problem? The problem is that for our people, both here and throughout the world, that is not understood to have the same powerful sacred value as the Kotel, as that particular place. So in a sense, we are still exiled from that place that we also want full access to. How can it be that because I'm a woman, I can't have full access to that sacred site? That can't be, that has to change.
So your language is very interesting, because I always thought that compromise was fine. Everybody has their place. That one place, the Orthodox have their synagogue. It's almost, I felt that this had a synagogue type solution. Everybody had their shul at the Western Wall, but I was very comfortable with liberal Judaism being in the Southern Wall.
Right.
Wasn't that magnanimous of me?
That was wonderful.
I felt
and it's nice because you're a man too, so you can go there.
So I could go to either one, and I felt very comfortable with it. But you're saying your experience is of being exiled.
Right,
from that place.
That's like telling somebody that the Temple Mount is actually elsewhere. It's not. It's there. It's in that place. And that's where we should have equal access.
So how would you have equal access? What would you do?
I think that it's actually really quite simple. I think on certain days of the week, for certain hours, it would be as it is today. We could maintain certain days and certain hours, but we could certainly maintain and respect the status quo. And there would be other days, and I would hope it would be on Torah reading days as well, where we would share. Some days of the month, it would be the status quo, and other days of the month it would have the status that the Southern Wall has today. Yachloku, we would have to share it, not divide it, but time share it.
Interesting. You know, there is a model of time sharing in Marat HaMachpelah, in Hebron, where, in the tombs of our
matriarchs and patriarchs.
Of our matriarchs and patriarchs. There we actually share it, but you know who we share it with? We share it between Jews and Muslims.
We may be doing that in more areas in the future, and I think it's not a bad solution.
But could we share? Now, so often we can be so much more tolerant, and I think this is one of the problems in Israel. Well, there is great religious pluralism in Israel if you are a Christian or a Muslim.
Or
Christians or Muslims, Orthodox are very comfortable with other religious traditions, as long as you don't claim to be Jewish. It's when you claim to be Jewish that all of a sudden the controls fall into place.
Right.
Our great challenge is, how do we share it also with liberal Jews who don't belong here?
The challenge is certainly great, but I think we have no other choice. I think for the sake of the relationship of world Jewry to this sacred land and to that sacred place, we have no choice but to change it and find a way to share it.
Rachel, I want to end with one question. Imagine you're the prime minister. And I want to put in front of you, this is where it really gets difficult. While reform and conservative and liberal synagogues are beginning to grow and increase here in the state of Israel, statistically, they still don't compete with the ultra-Orthodox. And secular Israelis still aren't identifying with liberal Judaism. That leaves the mass of liberal Jews outside of Israel, not in Israel. As a prime minister of Israel, you have to build a coalition. And what do? Here it is. I want Israel to be sensitive to world Jewry. I want religious pluralism. But at the end of the day, I need a coalition. These are the people who are going to vote. These are the voices I need, the votes I need to keep my coalition going. So I could create economic reform. I can do the foreign policy moves I need. If you were the prime minister and you had to choose, do you think that your primary responsibility is to the Israelis, or your primary responsibility is to world Jewry?
Your father's famous for saying that Israel's way too important to leave to the Israelis, which I laughed at many years ago, but more and more I see how wise that is. The primary responsibility of the prime minister certainly is to its citizens, and especially on issues of the economy, foreign policy, military issues, security issues. Primarily, he or she has to listen to those voices. But if Israel is to be the homeland for the Jewish people, and not just the country for its citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish, then it will have to listen to the voices of Jews throughout the world. And that is going to mean, for the sake of Israel, the prime minister listening on issues of Judaism, on Jewish pluralism, on the status of Jews, to the voices and to the needs of world Jewry, and not just Israeli Jewry.
Even if it means bringing down the coalition?
Even if it means bringing down the coalition, I think the prime minister will be taking a major move of leadership in redefining for Israelis, this country belongs to Israelis and to the Jews of the world on certain issues.
And if it doesn't, then he's not fulfilling his responsibility also to the Israelis.
Then he or she has failed the country on many levels.
Thank you. The Jewish people have a long record as the advocates of minorities. We are often on the side of the downtrodden. We were the downtrodden, and as a result, that was our natural affinity group. Something is changing in Israel. I don't know if it's the power. There's something. As we've moved to sovereignty, it doesn't seem that the same instincts are there anymore. What do you believe are some of the central causes for this? Or could you explain it?
It's hard to explain. First of all, this is an area where we really need to shift away from advocacy if we're going to really deal with the issues. Let's not forget that Israel deserves credit for some of the things it does in its treatment of minorities. In some areas, it goes beyond what international law requires. It certainly outshines its neighbours. But there is this sense of discrimination within Israeli society that we can't wish away. And this is an issue that the Jewish people shouldn't have a passing grade at. We need to excel at.
Let's take this for example. I understand we've been at war and we're still a functioning democracy. Arab minorities still vote. So that's correct. But we don't allocate our national resources equitably. There's increasing statements about what type of communities we could create. There's discriminatory language coming into the society. So there are great moves, but there's an undercurrent where Arab schools aren't funded, municipalities aren't equally funded, building rights aren't equally funded. So we're better than our neighbors, but that's not enough for us.
It's certainly not enough. I mean, the facts are complex here. In some areas we're better, in some areas we're worse. But at the core, I think, is this idea that we have conflated the security situation we find ourselves in with the rights that all our citizens should be entitled to. Yes, we have a very complex situation. Our minority is emotionally and certainly ethnically connected to those we feel we're in conflict to. And that has, I think, allowed, to a certain extent, or given legitimacy to a mood in society that they are less entitled, perhaps, that we need to be wary. Now, we do need to be wary, but we need to be wary about our wariness as well.
What do we have to be wary about?
Well, I think that there is legitimate concern that there are some elements within the minority community that are supportive of Israel's enemies, of Hamas, of Hezbollah in the war. This is something that creates a real problem at a societal level. But where it gets dangerous is where we begin on the track of discrimination, of labeling or attributing a security threat that might come from an individual or a group of individuals to an entire community. And based on that, determining what it is they're entitled to. The rights that a citizen has within a state are not subject to good behaviour. They're not conditional on good behaviour. We need to separate those two issues out. If there is a security threat, not a security thought, not a thought that is dangerous. We're a democracy, we're a Jewish democracy, which means we have to allow for a lot of thoughts that we don't like.
They push it. They push the limit.
They push it, but we have to know how to...
Their members of Knesset get up and they declare allegiance to the people who we despise. What should we do?
On that, first of all, a lot of Israelis get angry about that. I quite like those moments because it makes me proud of the maturity of a Jewish society where we can withstand those kind of comments. I don't see it as a threat, that particular thing. The thought and the opinion is something that a Jewish democracy has to give space for. When there is a security action that threatens from a particular individual, that of course needs to be dealt with. But let's de-link it from the rights that every citizen has. They are rights. They're not there as of sufferance. So, in a way, I think, we still act as if we're a minority and we're still under threat. And we're looking around to see where is that next threat coming from and how are we going to protect ourselves against it. And it's time we need to claim the maturity and the magnanimity that a majority in a sovereign state needs to have without losing the caution we need. But it's a caution that is governed by law and is specific, not discriminatory.
But where the trauma of the conflict is not just affecting the Israeli soldier who has, post-traumatic syndrome. It's the whole society seems to be having this trauma, but its consequence is on a completely different orientation towards our minority. Is there any hope to rectifying this, or are we saying, listen, we'll be as good as we can be for a while, until once the conflict is over, then we'll be fine, and until which time we're under trauma?
Well,
because we're still in danger.
Yeah, I think this needs to be divided in a few levels. There's the level of legislation, what the law requires that a democracy provide all its citizens. In that area, I simply think that Jews who care about this state being Jewish, it's not just about the democracy of the state, it's also about the Jewishness of the state. This is a Jewish value we're talking about. Should simply demand that this country live up to those ideals. The second aspect of this is the way the society feels, towards its minorities. Now here I think we need to divide between what it is that is not dependent on the conduct, on the situation around us, what it is that our leaders need to say, that our educators need to teach.
That has nothing to do with Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas.
Absolutely.
What are they?
Well, I think the basic fact that each person created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God deserves to be treated on his merits, not based on the group that he or she is associated to. This notion that we have predetermined ideas about what someone from a minority group or from any group thinks, how they will act, what threat they pose to you, is a fundamentally discriminatory notion that we need to throw out from us. Now, it's not going to be a pretty picture for a while, I think. The conflict does weigh on it. And I frankly think that the leaders of the Palestinian Arab minority have responsibilities too. And in some areas, it is contingent on the kind of attitude we have from the minority towards us, what we as a majority are able to offer. But in some areas, it's simply not contingent.
Schools.
In schooling, in legislation, but also in the way we speak, I think. I don't think we as a Jewish people can allow the kind of rhetoric, frankly of racist rhetoric, that has pervaded the Israeli public space.
Let's talk about that, because it's remarkable. That issue of rhetoric is a very important point. What's causing this shift in rhetoric? Why is it that today you're allowed to say certain things? A xenophobia, a borderline racism. You can get up and say, you can't have Arabs can't live in my neighborhoods. There's things that we're allowing ourselves to say. Once you start talking, policy is just around the corner.
Yeah. I mean, we know as a people what words are, how dangerous they can be. And this is an area, 30 years ago, I think if Meir Kahane, the leader of Kach, would get up in Knesset, a lot of people would leave the hall. And I worry that you hear the same kind of things today and people don't leave.
Do you have any thoughts as to why? What's caused that shift?
I have a thought, but it's more connected to something a little bit more spiritual, not so specific. I think it's that we've lost touch with our aspirations as a people. We're in the mess of the battleground of protecting the Jewishness of the state. There are threats from without, there are threats from within, and we're focused on this constant attrition about how we're going to protect it. And when you do that, your values and your aspirations get diluted, because everything is sacred for the sake of protecting that notion. And in the end, it's not worth protecting because through what you have become in order to protect it.
I have a feeling that there's another cause, because we've had the conflict before. We're actually more powerful now than ever before. Maybe we feel weaker, but there's a dissonance between our actual power and the perception of power, which is a very interesting thing in Israeli society. But I very often feel that when you spoke about our aspirations, I think we've bought into a lot of the rhetoric that we can't be a democratic state, that a Jewish nation state contradicts a democratic state. And once we've given up that aspiration, we failed, so we'll continue to fail. We don't believe we could be outstanding, and so we're living up to the lower expectations. In order for it to be a Jewish state, we have to discriminate. So once you allow a little discrimination in, then the rules have changed. I think that's something that's happening in Israeli society. We don't care anymore.
Well, this very interesting point, because this dichotomy that has become pretty popular in Israeli society, that, well, you can be for minority rights, but then you're really not so interested in Israel as a Jewish state. You're interested in a democracy.
Right.
Or you can be for Jewish rights, in which case you have to abandon a little bit. You have to allow for your democratic principles to be consistent. In my mind, it's neither Jewish nor democratic in a way. The notion that in order to be Jewish, we need to somehow give up the idea of equality for the other is not, in my mind anyway, a Jewish idea. And the notion that a democracy doesn't have space for Jewish identity, the majority to express itself in the public space, is not a democratic idea.
So we've lost on both directions.
I think we have. A Palestinian state is becoming a necessity for Israel. It's a threat to a certain extent, because we don't yet know how to ensure it's not a failed state or a terrorist state. But assuming we can do that, it's a necessity because our capacity to ensure a viable Jewish and democratic state depends, at least to some extent, on the ability we have by agreement, not all of it.
This is a very important point, because very often people speak about the Palestinian state as necessary for the demographic issue. Yeah. So that we make sure that we could be demographic, we could be a majority of Jews, as long as there are Palestinians, as long as we don't control the West Bank and Gaza. What you're arguing for is that the need for a Palestinian state, for a resolution of the conflict, is to enable the resurgence of a democratic sensibility, a democratic psychology, in which we could see each other as post-conflict and then begin to create a new identity, a new civic identity.
I think that's right. I think that a lot turns on whether we're able to realize Palestinian self-determination side by side, Jewish self-determination. Not because this is what will give the Palestinian minority its civil rights. I think that's what they're entitled to already. But for us to be at a place, a kind of equality that the Jews hoped for in the past, requires for the Palestinian minority to have a place where their territorial self-determination is realized, so that they expect less of Israel, and perhaps we as a society...
And then they can get more.
Yeah, and we as a society can offer them more.
And offer them more. You know, we speak about Jewish and democratic state. It's our challenge to make sure that we interpret Judaism in such a way that it coincides with and lives with democratic principles. And there is no doubt that we have a serious internal struggle on this question. But on the issue of minorities, we have yet another one. And that is that as long as we are in a constant state of war, it undermines our ability to fulfill our democratic aspirations, not from a legal perspective. And as Tal said absolutely correctly, we have to distinguish between those issues which are security issues and those issues which have to do with the inalienable rights of people. But there is a deeper psychological issue going on here. And that Israeli society, both Jews and Arabs alike, are shackled in a conflict. And by being shackled in that conflict, we're not enabling ourselves, we're not moving forward to create the type of possibilities in which we could see each other as citizens of one society, demanding of each other, expecting from each other, and actually giving to each other. A democracy requires, a society requires, a shared culture. We as Jews in this society want Judaism and the connection between the Jews of this society to have a shared cultural space which defines the Jewishness of this country. But we have to come to terms with the fact that there is a minority. And parallel to that culture of the majority, we have to find new avenues for a conversation, new avenues for a relationship. Maybe it'll only happen when peace comes. But if we put it on the table now, we can begin that process. Maybe we won't complete it now. But if we as a society are a society which is constantly working, constantly striving, constantly progressing, we will be ensuring that the democratic feature of this society is at the cornerstone of our aspirations and of our policies.